They say wisdom comes always with age, but sometimes truth walks into a courtroom wearing a suit 2 sizes too big. In a world that often underestimates youth and overlooks quiet brilliance, one teenage boy dared to stand where few would. This isn't just a story about law, it's a story about love, justice, and a brother's unwavering fight to be heard. If you've ever felt dismissed, ignored, or told you were too something to make a difference, Elijah Carrington's journey might just restore your faith in what's possible. 1. A teen walks into court and gets laughed at. There are moments in life when the world seems to pause, not out of respect, but out of disbelief. That was the scene one ordinary morning in Camilla, Georgia, when a teenage boy named Elijah Carrington walked into a courtroom wearing a borrowed suit that hung awkwardly from his shoulders. The sleeves were too long, his tie was slightly crooked, and the briefcase he carried looked like it had lived a dozen lives before reaching his hands. To the casual eye, he was just a child playing dress-up in a place built for power and prestige. The judge smirked, the spectators whispered, and for a brief, cutting moment, the air was thick with silent mockery. But here's the truth that generations of wise hearts have long understood. Appearances lie, and courage, real courage, doesn't shout. It enters quietly, steady and sure, even when wrapped in threadbare seams. Elijah wasn't there for spectacle. He wasn't looking for approval. He was there for one reason only, to speak on behalf of his older brother, Isaiah, who sat shackled and solemn, accused and overlooked. In a time when young people are so often dismissed, and in a system where the color of your skin and the weight of your wallet can tilt the scales of justice, Elijah's presence alone was an act of defiance. But what came next would defy more than just expectations. It would rattle assumptions, challenge authority, and remind everyone in that room of something older than the law itself. The power of conviction, the strength of family, and the quiet fire that burns in those who refuse to let truth be silenced. For anyone who's ever felt unseen, unheard, or underestimated, this is a story that speaks to you, because sometimes the most profound wisdom doesn't come from a degree or a title. Sometimes it walks into a courtroom with its chin held high, a heart full of purpose, and a voice the world didn't expect to remember. 2. Elijah Carrington steps up to defend his brother. In a world that often forgets the quiet battles fought behind closed doors, Elijah Carrington chose to step into the spotlight, not for glory, but for love. At just 17, he stood not as a polished lawyer, not as a seasoned advocate, but as a younger brother driven by loyalty deeper than blood and conviction stronger than fear. Isaiah, his older brother, sat accused of a crime that didn't fit the man Elijah knew, the man who had once walked him to school, tied his sneakers, and shielded him from neighborhood bullies. And now it was Elijah's turn to return the favor, to carry the weight his brother never asked him to carry. He didn't walk in with legal credentials. He came armed with something more powerful: relentless preparation and a heart unwilling to bend. For 2 years, Elijah studied quietly, by lamplight in the corner of the Camilla Public Library, with secondhand law books and grainy YouTube lectures as his teachers. He learned the language of justice the hard way. Not in classrooms, but through real pain, real doubt, in the relentless question that haunted him: what if no one else will fight for him? Older generations understand that kind of question. It echoes through time. It's the same question that has stirred parents to speak out, veterans to stand tall, and ordinary citizens to do extraordinary things when no one else would. Elijah's stand was a continuation of that legacy, a testament to what can happen when someone dares to believe in truth over title, love over fear. And so he stood, trembling only on the inside as he addressed the court with the strength of someone who had nothing to lose except the silence that would haunt him if he did nothing. His brother needed a voice. Elijah became one. And in doing so, he reminded everyone in that courtroom, and everyone listening, that the pursuit of justice doesn't start with law school. Sometimes it starts with love, a library card, and a young man brave enough to say, "I will." 3. The judge and the courtroom. Doubt his ability. The silence that met Elijah Carrington's declaration was not respectful. It was loaded. A silence that crackled with disbelief, quiet chuckles, and the hum of unspoken judgment. In the eyes of the courtroom, he was just a boy in a borrowed suit, clutching papers like they could protect him from what was coming. Judge Raymond Tolbert smirked, not cruelly, but condescendingly, as if he were watching a child stumble into a world he couldn't possibly understand. The gallery leaned in, not out of curiosity, but out of expectation, waiting for him to fail. But what they couldn't see, was what lay beneath that too large jacket, a young man forged in love, loss, and long hours of solitude, studying when the world around him slept. They saw a boy. What stood before them was a fireproof soul. Still, the doubt hung thick in the air. Every raised eyebrow, every sideways glance, every pause in the judge's speech was a reminder that Elijah wasn't just fighting for his brother. He was fighting to be taken seriously in a room that had already dismissed him. No credentials, no gray hair, no title, just knowledge, grit, and a heart full of purpose. For older viewers who have ever been told they were too old, too soft, or too late, Elijah's moment is a mirror, because doubt doesn't care about age. It comes for us all, but so does courage. And sometimes the most powerful response isn't a shouted rebuttal or a dramatic outburst. It's standing your ground with steady hands and a clear voice, knowing that truth, no matter how softly spoken, will always echo louder than judgment. They doubted him, but Elijah didn't come to impress them. He came to change the ending. And slowly, without fanfare, the courtroom began to shift. Not because he demanded respect, but because he earned it. 4. A shocking cross-examination exposes the truth. There's a certain hush that falls over a room when truth begins to rise. It's not loud. It doesn't need to be. It comes with clarity, with precision, with the steady hand of someone who has nothing left to prove, but everything left to protect. That's how Elijah Carrington stood when he approached the witness stand, facing a seasoned officer nearly 3 times his age. The young man's voice didn't shake, his hands didn't fumble. And when he laid down the time-stamped photo, the one that exposed a lie buried in the officer's report, the courtroom stilled, as if the very walls had leaned in to listen. This wasn't just a question of misfiled evidence or an innocent mistake. It was a moment that peeled back the thin veil of assumed authority and exposed what happens when no one expects to be questioned. Elijah, armed only with his preparation and principle, turned a courtroom into a crucible of reckoning. His questions were calm but cutting, his tone respectful but resolute. And with every word, the narrative the prosecution had so neatly packaged began to unravel. To those in the room who'd come expecting entertainment, or worse, confirmation of their assumptions, this moment hit like a thunderclap. For the older generations watching, it stirred something deeper. A remembrance of battles once fought, injustices once endured, and the unshakable power of standing on the side of truth, even when the odds are stacked sky high. Elijah wasn't showing off. He was showing up for his brother, for his community, and for a version of justice that had long been forgotten. He didn't need a title to demand the truth. He only needed the courage to speak it out loud, and the wisdom to let the facts do the talking. And in that moment, even those who had doubted him found themselves silent, not in mockery, but in awe. Evidence begins to crumble, misconduct uncovered. What began as a seemingly open and shut case soon began to unravel like a loose thread on a well-worn garment. Elijah Carrington didn't need to shout or pound the table. He simply laid the truth down, piece by careful piece, until even the most skeptical faces in the room began to shift. With the poise of someone far beyond his years, he pulled apart the case against his brother, not with anger, but with airtight logic and unshakable facts. A signed statement from the alleged victim, overlooked. A receipt for the laptops, ignored. A neighbor's security footage, never reviewed. Elijah had done what seasoned attorneys sometimes forget. He went looking for the truth instead of settling for the narrative. And when he stood before the judge with each of those facts in hand, something remarkable happened. The weight of assumption began to lift. But what struck deepest wasn't just the facts. It was what they revealed. A system that had chosen speed over scrutiny, an officer whose casual bias had slipped into dangerous territory, a prosecutor who hadn't bothered to ask the right questions. Elijah revealed more than inconsistencies. He exposed the human cost of convenience in the courtroom, how quickly lives can be judged, cases closed, and people forgotten, all because someone didn't dig deep enough. For those who've lived long enough to see mistakes swept under rugs, to hear the phrase, "that's just how it works," more times than they care to count, Elijah's quiet persistence is more than impressive. It's a form of healing. He reminded the room that justice is not about power, but about precision, not about closing a case, but opening the truth. And when the judge finally looked up, not with amusement, but with reflection, many in that courtroom, especially those with silver in their hair and stories of their own, recognized the moment for what it was. Not just a victory for Elijah, but a reckoning for a system that had forgotten how to listen. 6. Witness testimony reveals racial bias and setup. Sometimes the truth doesn't arrive with a bang, but with a quiet voice and a trembling confession. When Elijah Carrington called Travis Dent to the stand, no one expected the air in the courtroom to shift. But shift it did. Travis, a working-class mechanic with a weary face and honest hands, spoke words that cracked the walls of pretense wide open. In front of a judge, a prosecutor, and a room now gripped by silence, he testified to what so many had only suspected. This wasn't just a misstep by law enforcement. It was personal. With each word, the illusion of fairness began to fall apart. Travis revealed that the arresting officer, his own cousin, had spoken bitterly about getting Isaiah Carrington, about being tired of seeing those boys walking around like they owned the place. And with one cold, calculated sentence, one anonymous call is all it takes in this town, the mask of impartiality slipped. This wasn't law at work. This was vendetta wrapped in a badge. For older viewers, especially those who've lived through generations of quiet injustice and watched power wielded as a weapon, that moment was more than a testimony. It was vindication. It confirmed what so many have known in their bones but rarely heard spoken in a court of law. That bias, when left unchecked, becomes not just dangerous, but destructive. Elijah didn't gloat. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stood still and let the silence do what words could not, reveal the truth in its rawest form. And in that stillness, many saw themselves reflected, not in Elijah's youth, but in his fire, his fearlessness, his unwillingness to let things slide just because they always have. That day, the courtroom didn't just hear testimony. It heard history repeating, and finally someone brave enough to interrupt it. 7. Elijah challenges the judge with case law and courage. There's something sacred about watching a young person speak truth to power, not with defiance, but with dignity. When Elijah Carrington stood before Judge Tolbert, it wasn't to provoke, nor to perform. It was to remind the court that justice, real justice, doesn't wear a robe or answer only to a gavel. It answers to truth. And in that moment, the balance of the courtroom subtly shifted. A teenager armed with nothing but case law and courage began to challenge a system that had long favored structure over soul. With steady breath and a voice that never once cracked, Elijah cited rulings older than himself. Yick Wo v. Hopkins, Owens versus State of Georgia, decisions that lived deep in legal books few ever read. But he didn't recite them like a student. He lived them like a witness. He wasn't quoting precedent to impress the bench. He was drawing a line in the sand, saying, "This matters. This still applies. This is why my brother's life deserves your full attention." For many in that room, especially the elders who had fought quieter battles in years past, Elijah's words stirred something timeless. They remembered the marches, the hearings, the moments they were told to sit down, stay quiet, wait their turn. And here was this young man, uncredentialed, uninvited, and unstoppable, offering not just legal argument, but moral clarity. Judge Tolbert didn't interrupt. Not this time. He sat still, his expression unreadable, as Elijah gently yet firmly held him accountable. Not out of arrogance, but necessity. Because what Elijah knew and what older hearts understand too well is that justice doesn't just need rules. It needs reminders. It needs people brave enough to say, "We remember what fairness looks like, and we won't stop until we see it again." And so Elijah spoke, not just to a judge, but to a generation. And every sentence reminded the courtroom, courage may come young, but it carries the wisdom of ages. 8. The courtroom shifts from doubt to respect. Respect doesn't come all at once. It arrives slowly like morning light through stained glass, bit by bit, illuminating what had always been there but hadn't yet been seen. That's how it happened in the courtroom that day. The same gallery that once smirked and whispered as Elijah Carrington stood alone behind the defense table now sat in reverent stillness. No longer was he just a kid in an oversized suit. He had become something else entirely, a symbol of something the system had forgotten. Earned authority without entitlement. His calm presence, his unwavering words, and his mastery of truth reshaped the room, moment by moment. The smirks faded, the scoffs silenced. Even the judge who once looked down from the bench with amusement now leaned forward, listening. Not because he had to, but because he wanted to understand. Respect, after all, isn't demanded. It's drawn out, carved patiently through action, humility, and conviction. And Elijah carved it deep. The prosecutor sat stiffly now, no longer confident in the foundation of her case. The officer's silence spoke volumes, and the gallery, many of them older, long familiar with the sting of being underestimated, now watched with awe, some with tears not far from their eyes. They knew this shift. They had lived it before in boardrooms, in hospitals, in courtrooms of their own. It was the moment when doubt gives way to recognition, when bias makes room for truth. Elijah did not stand taller now. He didn't need to. It was the room that rose to meet him. For every older man or woman who had ever felt their worth questioned, their voice dismissed, their truth delayed, this was redemption in real time. He had shown that respect isn't granted by age or title, but by courage and clarity. And in doing so, Elijah not only changed how the courtroom saw him, he changed how it saw itself. 9. The verdict. All charges are dismissed. There are moments in life that arrive not with fanfare, but with a stillness so profound it feels holy. That was the silence just before Judge Tolbert returned to the bench, robe dragging slightly, face unreadable, as Elijah Carrington sat waiting. Elbows on the table, eyes steady, heart pounding with purpose. The courtroom held its breath, a room full of strangers bound now by something more than curiosity, hope. And then it came, not shouted, not celebrated, but spoken with solemn weight. The charges against Isaiah Carrington are hereby dismissed with prejudice. A phrase so powerful it cracked the room open like thunder. For a moment, there was no reaction, just release. Shoulders sank, eyes brimmed, even the air seemed lighter. And for Isaiah, still in his orange jumpsuit, it meant freedom, not just from the charges, but from the label that threatened to follow him for the rest of his life. Elijah didn't cheer. He didn't cry. He simply stood, calmly gathered his notes, and slipped them back into the same worn briefcase he'd arrived with, because this wasn't about glory. It was about doing what needed to be done. It was about restoring what should have never been taken. And as he approached the bench, the judge leaned in, not to lecture, but to admit something rare and real. You made me look in a mirror I've been avoiding for a long time. For older hearts who've seen courtrooms, communities, and lives torn apart by injustice, this was more than a ruling. It was a moment of reckoning. It reminded us that justice, though often delayed, can still arrive if someone is brave enough to chase it. Elijah didn't just win the case. He lifted a burden, redefined a narrative, and reminded a town, and perhaps the country, that justice isn't a gift. It's a right, one that must be spoken for, even by a voice no one expected to hear. 10. A quiet victory, but a powerful change begins. Some victories don't end with applause. They end in a quiet walk across cracked pavement, in the scent of old library books, in a familiar face at a front desk saying, "I'm proud of you." After the gavel fell and the courtroom emptied, Elijah Carrington didn't seek the spotlight. He didn't linger on courthouse steps for cameras or praise. He rode his bicycle, yes, his bicycle, down the same sidewalk he had traveled countless times before. Not as a local boy with something to prove, but as a young man who had already proven more than anyone expected. He returned not to a podium, but to the Camilla Public Library, the sanctuary where it all began. The woman behind the desk, Miss Harmon, had watched him grow up with headphones in, highlighters out, chasing justice one borrowed book at a time. She didn't need a judge's ruling to tell her who he was. She already knew. And when she hugged him, it wasn't just congratulations, it was a benediction. That moment, quiet and deeply human, reminded us all of something older generations understand better than most. Real change doesn't happen in flashes. It happens in stillness, in discipline, in the long, patient walk towards something better. Elijah's case may have ended in one courtroom, but the echo of his voice began to ripple through a town that had long accepted things as they were. 3 weeks later, a local teen stood up at a town meeting and proposed a fund to help other students prepare for college exams. And who stood beside him? Not in a robe, but in simple clothes, as a man trying to do better? Judge Tolbert. Because when you wake up a room, you wake up a community. Elijah didn't just win for Isaiah, he opened a door. And in doing so, he reminded everyone watching, especially those who've lived long enough to see hope dim, that it only takes one steady voice to reignite what once felt lost. 11. Elijah returns to the library that raised him. Some homes don't have front porches or dinner tables. Some are made of silence, soft light in the turning of pages. For Elijah Carrington, that home was the Camilla Public Library, a place that never asked for credentials, only curiosity. And on the day the town whispered his name with a reverence it once denied him, Elijah didn't run towards celebration. He walked back to where it all began, to the place that had raised his mind when the world didn't yet see his worth. The library smelled just as it always had, of old carpet and stories waiting to be heard. At the front desk sat Miss Harmon, glasses taped at the bridge, hair pulled back in the same messy bun she'd worn for years. She looked up from her crossword puzzle, peering over the rim with a smile only elders know how to give, the kind that says, "I knew before anyone else." "You did it, didn't you?" she asked. Elijah didn't need to answer. She already knew. She came around the desk, arms open, and pulled him into a hug that smelled of cinnamon gum and old bookmarks. "Don't let this town shrink you," she whispered. "Not after what you've done." That moment, so quiet, so deeply rooted in love, said more than any courtroom ruling ever could. Because sometimes it's not about winning in front of an audience. Sometimes it's about coming back to the one place that believed in you when no one else did. That library had seen him tired, discouraged, invisible. Now it saw him radiant. Older hearts know the meaning of that return. They know the value of full circle moments, the kind that remind us we're never too young to lead, never too old to learn, and never too small to make a difference. Elijah didn't say much. He just walked to the back, took his seat at the worn table in the corner, opened a book, and began again. Not for praise, but for purpose. Because some stories don't end when the gavel falls. They begin when the boy comes home to read. 12. From teen defender to local legend. In the weeks that followed, something began to shift. Not just in the courthouse, but in the town itself. Elijah Carrington, once the boy in the too big suit, became more than a headline. He became a symbol. Not of rebellion, but of resolve. Not of anger, but of unwavering hope. His story traveled, not by television or fame, but by word of mouth, passed quietly from neighbor to neighbor like something sacred. "Did you hear what that boy did?" they'd say in barbershops, church pews, and porches lit by the slow fade of evening sun. He didn't seek the spotlight. There were no press conferences, no parades, just a young man who kept showing up at the library, at town hall, and sometimes beside other students who'd heard about his case and needed help of their own. He sat with them, answered their questions, lent them his notes, and reminded them that being unheard doesn't mean you're unworthy. For older hearts, Elijah's quiet rise struck a familiar chord. They had seen it before, in the child who grows into a teacher, the protester who becomes a leader, the soft voice that one day moves a crowd. And in Elijah, they saw the next chapter of that story. A reminder that legacy isn't about medals or titles. It's about moments when someone chooses courage over comfort, truth over silence, and service over self. Elijah didn't change overnight. He just kept showing up with his books, his questions, and his belief that justice should not be a privilege. It should be a promise. And in doing so, he reminded a town, and perhaps a generation, that even the smallest voice can echo loudly if it speaks from the heart. Teen. The message. Truth has no age, and courage needs no title. In the end, Elijah Carrington didn't walk away with a trophy, a scholarship, or his name in lights. But what he carried with him was far more enduring, a quiet legacy, born not of recognition, but of revelation. He showed an entire town, and perhaps even the country, that truth does not need permission to stand tall. It doesn't need credentials to be heard. And courage, real courage, does not wait for titles, degrees, or the nod of approval from those in power. It simply steps forward, even when its voice trembles. Elijah reminded us that justice is not a privilege reserved for the polished or the powerful. It is a right, and like so many elders who once marched, wrote letters, cast ballots, or simply refused to be silent in their own time, he took a stand that reached beyond himself. He spoke not just for his brother, but for every person who has ever been told, "You don't belong here." For older Americans, his story feels both new and achingly familiar. It echoes generations of struggle, perseverance, and quiet rebellion. And in watching him, this boy with a worn briefcase and the heart of an old soul, we are reminded that sometimes the most powerful voices come from those no one expected. And sometimes the greatest change begins not in the halls of Congress or the headlines of national news, but in a small-town courtroom with one young man who decided that silence was no longer an option. So if you've ever wondered whether your voice still matters, whether truth can still rise, whether courage can still change things, let Elijah's story be your answer, because justice doesn't come from who you are on paper. It comes from who you choose to be when the moment finds you. Elijah Carrington's story isn't just about a boy who defended his brother. It's about what becomes possible when we refuse to stay silent. For those who've weathered storms, who've fought battles quietly, or carried burdens in the dark, this tale is a gentle reminder. Your voice still matters. Truth still has power. And courage, no matter the age or title it wears, can ripple through generations. Sometimes the greatest justice isn't shouted. It's spoken softly, held in steady hands, and passed on, one brave soul at a time. And that, dear reader, is how change begins.